Greetings, welcome to Terra Prime Live, the weekly chat about sabering and all things sabering, Star Wars related. Today we've got a small panel. We've got another one coming, hopefully. With me today is Robert, one of our LX apprentices. So welcome, Robert. And
good
joining us
evening.
right now is our good friend Vornok from all the way in Glee Anselm. How are things there in the tropical paradise?
Pull up your web browser and look up Tropical Storm Bertha.
Yes, we did hear about it.
The edge of it is running right over my apartment.
Yikes! Well,
it's exciting.
There you go. An action-packed episode. So yeah, if the storm surge starts coming in, please keep us informed.
I will. We're uphill from the beach, but not that much.
Okay. All right.
How are you all tonight?
Good, good. Robert, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, Master. Thank you very much.
All right. Very good. All right. Well, tonight on the program, we're going to talk about something that we talk about a lot, but it is something that may need a little bit of delineation. And that's what is reality and the many kind of real situations that combat can be applied. So when somebody is looking at something, somebody's technique, somebody's drills, somebody's lesson, something like that, and wants to know if they can apply it in real life, that's not quite enough information, really. What you are going to need to do is figure out what do you mean by real life. And if you don't do that right away, a lot of things that you do you might discard prematurely, and you might need them in the future. So, for example, we'll go, you have spinning, turning around, and we've got like the Suma exercises in Hataru. And many of these exercises make you go around in 360 in a circle. We've got parries to the back, turns, jumps, all of these types of things. And these all seem to violate one of the cardinal rules of fighting, which is never turn your back on your opponent. And while that rule is definitely a good rule, it's applicable in a narrow kind of band of usage, meaning one-on-one in a kind of dueling situation or such. In other situations where things are either not as controlled, not as fair, or just not as expected, the act of spinning around may not be turning your back to an opponent, but you've already got your opponent to your back, and you need to spin around and find them and get them. Or if they've tried to take your back, you can turn around with them. So that's a good example of the kind of different things that we'll talk about tonight. Now, we've got a few different categories, and we're not going to probably hit all of them, but we'll hit most of them. And obviously, the most common one that I think we go through. Oh, welcome, Jeff. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Very good. Very good. Okay, so we're just kind of going into the different kind of contexts of combat. So, and I was just going into like where we have access to it. So we live. If you live, most of the places that are seeing this broadcast or seeing this webcast live in parts of the world where it's probably not very violent in comparison with historically with other parts of the world. All of that here in North America, we have violence, we have all of those problems, urban problems, and all that kind of thing. But we don't have duels in the street. We don't have you know, people chopping each other's heads off in the square, and you know, we don't have contact with a lot of this, with a lot of these other contexts that we're going to talk about. So the one context that we have a lot of contact with is the sparring situation, the controlled situation. And what can happen is, if we're constantly thinking of just that situation, is we tend to discard anything that doesn't work for that particular game. And that's great for that game, but as you want to kind of expand that, like as we do with saber combat, into choreography, into story, into martial art, into all this kind of stuff, you don't necessarily want to limit yourself to one area. You can. That's perfectly all right. But most of the people who are in this community like a whole lot of variety in what they do. So when people are striving for that variety, striving for those new things, you know, trying to find something innovative, right, and all of that, we want to try to think outside of the box, and the box being the arena, the ring, right? And this box is going to kind of represent the assumptions that we make, because this is pretty much most of what we come into contact with. So now we'll go into it with, obviously, with Robert here and elsewise. We do have people who go into combat, but it's much different than this type of combat, this kind of face-to-face saber combat. It's, you know, more, you know, firearms and ordnance and that kind of thing. But the principles still do apply. So as we're kind of like looking at things and judging their value, or what we want to do with them, or whether they can be applicable, or whatever, we want to try to open our mind to the other types of contexts. And again, with the example of the Vataru and the Suma, turning your back. And if we go with the assumptions, when somebody says, well, you're never going to turn your back on your opponent, so spins are useless. They're fun and they're fancy, but you're never going to turn your back on your opponent, so you're never going to do a spin. And that assumes a whole boatload of stuff. Number one, you have one opponent. Number two, they're in front of you. Number three, they're going to remain in front of you. Right? These three things you have to toss out of the window, because those will not happen most of the time, other than in a controlled kind of sparring, you know, practice session or competitive session where nobody's really trying to kill each other. People are sneaky, you know, when things are life and death, and when we talk about what we want to put into choreography to make it look real, to make it look exciting, and to try to strike that balance between, you know, believable and still exciting and watchable. We don't want to toss the baby out with the bathwater, because we're only thinking, it's just one person against one person, and then one person against one person, and then one person against one person, all right? In realistic situations, and where martial arts came from, and where all of these exercises come from situations where you have zero control over what's going to happen. Either urban environments, like with crime or crime fighting, battlefield in military senses, both mounted, unmounted, you know, all of that kind of thing. And you know, self-defense, bodyguards, what we would consider armored car services, where people would escort goods and services across large distances to guard them from bandits and stuff like that. You know, none of these situations in which these martial arts, in which we are drawing all of our material from, assume or is it even likely that your opponent is going to appear in front of you, unless they can really screw up, right? Now, battlefield may be, right, but it's not going to be one guy. You know, it's going to be you and your guys, and them and their guys, and, well, it takes on an entirely different type of, you know, type of feel. And as we get into it, strategy. And that's really where it comes into, strategy. So like spinning, you got to get good to spin because, yeah, sure, I don't want to turn my back to an opponent, but what if an opponent appears at my back, right? Well, I have to turn my front to him. So we can think about it in that way, and all that. So why don't I open it up to the panel here? Does anybody have anything to add, or does it bring up any thoughts before we move on?
I do know that during combat there is a lot of this older concept. 1700s, 1800 combat. You have line versus line, and yes, your enemy is going to appear in front of you, group versus group. The modern warfare strategy isn't symmetrical anymore. It's completely asymmetrical. So your enemy could literally be coming from your right and your left and behind you. And if you don't know how to rotate, how to turn, how to defend yourself from a different angle, or how to move and respond to your enemy's motions, standing is dying. And if you can't rotate and adjust and deflect and control, well, then that's going to be you, the not living one. We're going to try to avoid that, and that's why we teach this.
Right, right. And you bring up another really good delineation, which is modern warfare and, historical warfare. Because as I was saying, when we were talking about symmetrical lines, this comes from when they weren't using a whole lot of projectiles. They would do a volley of projectiles, and then the foot soldiers would come in and melee, hand to hand with swords and spears and that kind of thing. Like you said, nowadays, it can come from above. I mean, you can be attacked by land, sea, air, everywhere. Not only can you be outmanned, but you can be ridiculously outgunned. So, these tip the scales. And when we do extreme stuff in training, what you're doing is you're just trying to set that bar high enough so that when it comes to the emergency, to the, oh, geez, I need it, right? It's going to be there for you in spades. You've got enough reserve up there. I can turn 360, so turning 180, not a big deal, right? I will never get dizzy. I will never get out of sorts simply turning 180 anymore, right? When I first started martial arts, I remember the first time I got really good socked in the face, and that whips your head around, right? And just that much will, whoa, you completely lose your equilibrium. So these are all good things to think about. Anyone else?
Yeah,
oh yes.
One thing I was taught when I started martial arts, and I still bring it up with my students all the time. And it's a little saying that my instructor told me. He said, training is not sparring. Sparring is not fighting, and fighting is not combat. All those things are different. We train basic techniques so that we can spar. And when you spar, your intent is not to hurt your opponent, it's to learn. But when we fight, you're fighting to hurt somebody. And combat is more along the lines of life or death. So a lot of people try and group them all together, and they're not the same thing. And until you can separate those and understand what each one is good for and what skills each one builds, you don't really understand a lot of the techniques until you can apply them to all four of those different types of training, because they're all types of training. But combat is not training. It's not learning. So a lot of people don't really understand it until they've been in it and done it.
Yes. No. Absolutely. I think that's really the thrust, is that in the past there was a greater chance, and of course if you're in certain parts of the world, there's a greater chance as well that you will experience combat. Most of us will, the most we're going to get into is a fight, right? I've been in plenty of fights, I'm sure lots of here, some of us on the panel have been in combat, but, in the past, there was a greater chance that you would be born into a place, social strata, area, whatever, where you would just, at a certain age, just be conscripted into whatever army, whatever's there, and probably die nameless in some field. And that was just a fact of life through so much of our history, right? Everywhere, and in some parts of the world, hopefully not as many, right? It is still kind of that reality, and we want to change that. But so we don't have a lot of contact with it unless we kind of go out and we find it, and we can definitely lose sight of what exactly is going on and what we're doing, because we're going to be kind of pigeonholing what we do so much. And I think because we like to bring in so much of the story and so much of this extra stuff to what we do, because it's a lightsaber and all, I think these scenarios will behoove us, and that's why these drills, these skills are included. Will you ever, do a butterfly kick to a to a twist and score a hit on somebody? If you do, I hope somebody is shooting it, because that would be awesome. I wouldn't consider it a high percentage, but that's it. Matthew Vornock, you got anything to add to the conversation at this bit?
Oh, there's the problem. My mic has been muted.
Aha.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. No. All right. I was trying to talk and nothing was going through. Generally, all I was going to add is the thing to remember when you're looking in at what someone else is doing is the context of how exercises and technique are being applied in. And I think that's kind of one of the underlying themes that we're talking about today. We seek meaning. We try and understand things that we don't quite get yet, and so we apply our own experience. So it's good to come into this with an open mind. Look at what someone else is doing, and if it doesn't agree with your perspective on the world, what other influences are there that could be leading someone to undergo whatever exercise they're in?
Yes, I absolutely. There's the aspect of the context that we're talking about. There's also, as long as you're kind of keeping that open mind, there's going to be more stuff that you're going to want to, try here, there, or wherever when you strike at head or foot level, right? If you're striking very, very low, that's another question that will come in. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. A lot of times, again, we're going to go back to the assumptions. One of the assumptions that's made with that, why are you striking so low, is the assumption that we're fighting on level ground, right? Somebody may be uphill and somebody may be downhill. The person who is uphill is going to have to be, kind of coming down. That's why they have the advantage, because they have the advantage of gravity, right? And we're about to get into the strategy aspects of it. But you can't kind of take that advantage unless you are used to going down, allowing your weight to sink and kind of moving into it and with it and all of that kind of stuff. And so that's where the strategies that you will apply are going to be born out of these contexts. All right. So while we talk a lot about the one-on-one sparring aspect, as we do most of the time here, we'll put that aside for tonight, and we'll just kind of talk about some of the other ones which we don't have as much contact with. And that we also preface this by saying that I do believe that's a good thing, that we're not constantly fighting for our lives, so that we can use this as a game. So I feel very lucky for that. Anyway, so yes. Did you have something to add there?
I was just going to say it is definitely a plus that we don't need to rely on these skills to get through life on a day-to-day basis. And that means it's a great opportunity for us to really explore some of these things in depth and at length.
Yes, yes, and in a very kind of astute, scientific and objective way, because we can take our time with it. We don't have to worry about our head ending up on a pike tomorrow. Yeah. So, yeah. So let's talk about the different types of things. And I like what you said, Jeff, with the training, the sparring, the fighting, and the combat. But if we look at just combat being the context that we're kind of looking at, I would say probably one of the biggest divisions is probably urban combat and battlefield combat. So we can kind of start with the urban stuff, because both of these things are going to have, or we can start with the battlefield stuff. Kind of different things. I don't know. Does anybody have a preference? Which one to? All right. Okay. Well, we'll just start here with the urban one. So, urban methods and martial arts and all that kind of thing are going to have a lot in common in the fact that they're going to be a lot about tight quarters, being outnumbered, being on the move, trying to make sure that you kind of know where your opponents are and that they're not kind of ganging up on you. And also, you are going to have to understand that you're going to be confined in your movements in different ways. Number one, if you are a person who is defending themselves or trying to apprehend a criminal, both things that happen in urban environments and where martial arts would be applied, right? You are going to have to worry about not hurting non-combatants. Right? So you can't just go ahead and just start blowing, just start swinging away through a crowd, right? You have to worry about hurting innocent bystanders, right? Now, an attacker, a criminal, or something like that, doesn't necessarily have to. Now, that is a huge advantage-disadvantage type of thing, which requires a lot of strategy on the part of the defender. You get a lot of secret weapons in urban type of things, so things that will fit in different places. You get a lot of close combat type of stuff, a lot of weapon deploy, here, that, and the other. But it also brings with it certain physical challenges that need to be met in the kind of in our training area. So do we, Jeff? Do you have anything to? I know, because I know you have a lot of experience in this stuff as well.
Yeah.
As far as like with some of the tactics that you think would be that are particular to that type of context idea.
Yeah, we do in our dojo. We're an Aikido dojo, and so there's a lot of misconception of Aikido, and we if you search out YouTube, there's so much garbage and there's so much good stuff. And so when I say we do Aikido, we do it traditionally. We learn the traditional techniques. We learn the traditional, I guess, standards that they started. But you got to look culturally at where it came from. It came from a culture they did not sit in chairs. They knelt. The Japanese, would kneel down rather than sitting in chairs. And I know that recently they've been adopting more of the modern. There's chairs there. Before, you would come into someone's house and there were no couches. There were pillows. You'd sit, kneel down. And so a lot of the techniques, we do a lot of stuff from a kneeling position, which is totally not applicable to our Western culture. It's just not, we don't kneel down. But we learn the basic techniques, and then what I do is I'll take a chair and stick it on the mat. And so then we do these techniques from a chair. So you look at, you're looking at training versus let's learn the cultural beginnings of this technique. And now let's look at the urban combat side of it. Let's look at what's actually going to happen when you get into this. If you're sitting down and someone's standing above you, you're not typically going to be kneeling unless someone has knocked you into a kneeling position. And so we try and we apply them both. And so anytime we run into, we're traditional where it counts is what I tell my students. Anybody that's starting to learn, we're traditional where it counts, and then we apply what's modern because it's there. If you ignore the modern stuff, you're not really training anything. You're just cutting yourself short.
Yeah, and it's funny because I seem to I know this is a big thing that happens with in manga in Japanese comic books, that there was a even back then there is a an idea that the dojo fighting is like it doesn't do any good. You know, it's too divorced from the battlefield, from reality, from actually doing it. People would make fun of people for just being able to fight with boken and all that kind of thing. And so the what do you call it? The various dojo or whatever, the samurai, because in certain periods or whatever, they kind of became more of an urban presence. And yeah, that was about yeah. Matt, did you want to interject something?
No, I'm where the conversation's going so far. It was just the thought that occurred to me as we're talking about training in different environments and in different contexts, and something that we've said and discussed on numerous occasions is the best way to train how to fight is to fight. But there's so much more behind that. There's so much more that is developmental to lead you up to that point. And the same can be said of a different, like an urban environment, becoming more familiar with the context of operating in a closed environment in a limited space.
Yeah. If you've ever seen the remake of Zatoichi, they do a great scene in there where Zatoichi gets tested by the other samurai, and he goes to draw, and Zatoichi draws it, reverse. The other guy does it, kind of traditional or whatever, and he's like, boom, and he like bumps right into him, and he can't actually get his sword out of his scabbard. And Zatoichi says to him, "You'll never draw in a place like this, like that. He's just too small." So, that's a good example of that kind of thing. So when you're training, and you think about like tight movements and being able to go from having something way out here, but then being able to draw it all the way in, almost right up next to you, is something that's really, really needed. You can come up with 1,000,001 scenarios where something like you're fighting somebody and their friends show up and they come in and attack you from either side, right, or whatever. So it's always going to be. The urban environment is chaos, but it's a kind of chaos that is, I don't know, maybe like a zombie apocalypse where everything's going really, really slow, but it's deceivingly slow. Like, oh, geez, they're right on top of me, because there's so much going on.
Yeah, one of the other things I did a couple of weeks ago with my sparring partner, David, I can't remember if I posted this to the page or not, but I took there's a Muay Thai dojo that rents from us also, so I took all their pads and threw them on the mat. So, we always spar in this sterile environment, there's no poles in the middle of the room, there's nothing that you can step on or sprain an ankle or do it, but that's not real life, and now we didn't have the option to be able to spar on a hill or anything, we're in the dojo, so we can't change terrain, so I changed as much as I could. And it was a totally enlightening experience. And what really happened there towards the end was, we had ended up clearing ourselves out a nice little space to fight in. But at the same time, you've got to clear that space out. You go to fight somebody and you go to move and you can't move there. There's a big pad in the way, or you've either got to step on it or step over it or step around it or kick it out of the way. And there are a couple of times I actually kicked the pad at him and distracted him, and then came in, because he's got the longer staff, so it was a lot it was a neat way for me to distract him also. But just applying those small things, even in Aikido, we'll apply what we call airplane aisle techniques, where you have no option to move side to side. You either have to go forward, back, up, or down, but you're stuck in an aisle. So how do you do this technique that's normally done with this very large circular movement in one place? So, we'll apply a lot of that stuff too, just because it's you're in a movie theater, you're in an airplane, you're on a bus, you're somewhere where you cannot shift side to side. So we try and apply a lot of those too. That I think, again, that comes back into the urban combat. It's just a situation you might be in. In a restaurant where there's tables packed in tight, wherever. It might never happen, and again, I'm also very glad that doesn't occur on a daily basis. But if you never train it, you don't know what to do when it happens.
Yeah. Oh, and it's funny because I read an article a long time ago in Inside Kung Fu magazine, I believe, by or was it Black Belt? Anyway, it was an article, and this guy actually did research. He went and correlated police reports and emergency room visits with injuries for street fights and everything like that. And upwards of 80% of the injuries sustained in street fights did not occur from anything that either fighter did to each other. It was something in the environment. They tripped over a curb. They hit a door, a chair, a table. People have dumped over on garbage cans and broken their necks, because a guy pushed them. So it's definitely a thing to think about. I teach self-defense classes, and I make the distinction. There's fighting, there's self-defense. Fighting you do to win, Self-defense you do to escape. And the number one thing in escape is knowing how to get out of where you are, right? So what I'll usually do is I'll either turn out the lights if I have a light switch right there, or have everybody close their eyes and then say, quickly, tell me how many doors there are in this room, right? And, most people will know the door they came in, right? And that might be about it. They might know this, that, and the other, right? And then if they do know them, you go, okay, well, what's behind that door, right? What's in that? What's behind that door, right? If you don't know and you have no way to find out, well, those doors should be seen as walls, because if you go to one and it's a closet, you have one door that you can get out of. So depending on where you are in the room, you're going to need a certain set of skills to get from where you are to where you need to be, and that's going to go through there. Ataru is probably one, in our system, Ataru is probably going to contain the most material that's applicable to that stuff. Well, Shen as well. But Ataru especially, in a lot of the systems that I've trained, which are a lot of times trained alone in a monastic kind of scenario, they'll set up apparatus which create some variable, some level of chaos in your training environment. A good one is or a common one is they post poles in the ground in different patterns, and you fight and train inside these poles. So it helps you learn to maneuver around obstacles, around people, all of that. If you're doing it with another person, you have that added dimension of thought that you have to kind of go through as you're going through there. So it's all these exercises. There's a good one where it's a system of hanging bags, right? And you're within the bag. So you hit a bag, it starts to swing. It will hit other bags, which also start to swing, and then you move through those. So there's all kinds of ways that in the past people have trained this type of stuff with apparatus and stuff. But they almost inevitably will try to take what they learn from these things and put them into drills. And most of these drills will turn out to be like the things that are, spins and this type of the other. Because once you get into those situations, you're like, oh, wow, okay, now I kind of know what the physical and strategic demands are on me in this particular situation. I'm going to come up with some particular exercises that will really focus on those. And since there's very few schools out there that still teach this stuff because there really is no context for it, it's hard to find, and it's hard to kind of, wrap your head around. So that would be that. Did you have something, Jeff?
Oh yeah. Actually, just this past week, I was able to, I was looking at a lot of the Ataru stuff. I think I mentioned it in the sparring post I put up. But there were a couple times I actually was able to get a couple of good hits on David with the staff by actually turning my back. I didn't expect it. I didn't like it. It wasn't what I was normally doing because he was in front of me. But because of the continual movement of the blade, I was able to continue the movement, spin, and actually get a couple of really good shots on him. And he didn't see them coming. He had no clue they were coming because it's not something that typically you train to do.
That's a really good example too of something that will kind of bridge into this next thing, the battlefield. We'll go over here to Robert for some stuff on that. But the long weapon thing, if you have a shorter weapon, turning and spinning, rolling, you basically rolling down the length of the weapon, right, is the quickest and most efficient way to close distance on somebody who has a longer weapon, right? You are against it, so they either have to draw it away from you to get some sort of attack. Let's say it's a spear, so it's got a point, right? So they'll either have to draw it back, in which case you're rolling with it, right? As your back goes here, it's not threatening to us in an animal way, so it doesn't automatically raise the warning signs. You're like, oh, well, he's got his back turned to me. What can you do? I mean, we don't say those words because you don't have that time, but it goes like that, so it doesn't, you don't quite notice it, and then by the time you do, whap, right? And because you've got such a long weapon, it's unbelievably difficult when you've got somebody who is against one side of it to maneuver it to a successful parry. So, and that's where you get a lot of the spins and the twirls with the sticks. So you can see how that goes there, and so that can be applied to a battlefield situation or a urban situation, So there, Matthew, do you have anything to add to that before we move on to the next kind of category?
Just kind of reiterating some of this, and I'll keep it brief. I've played with the Society of Creative Anachronism in armored combat and fencing, and I was just visualizing the difference between fencing one person and two or three at the same time, and the dynamics of the movement just to keep yourself quote unquote alive are so drastically different. Anybody who observes this or tries this will see that yes, there is definitely a place for lots of big movement, running, turning. It's there.
Right. Yes. And the context of multiple opponents. You hear, well, that doesn't usually happen, right? And if you're in a situation where you've got multiple opponents, you're pretty much dead. And, well, it used to happen, well, it does happen all the time. In fact, it probably happens more often than not because people always try to, outnumber or
gain numerical superiority.
Excuse me?
Gain numerical superiority.
Yes, numerical superiority, exactly. All right.
And it may not happen as often for real life situation, but I just described one of many different types of games where it does happen on a regular basis.
Indeed. Robert, do you have something to add?
I was just thinking about numerical superiority. I'm 6'1", and I'm a pretty big guy. The average single person is not going to come to me. They're going to bring their two friends to come to me. And I have to think about numerical superiority, because if they're going to intend harm to me, they're not going to do it by themselves. They're going to bring their friends and their compatriots with them. Yes,
that's a very good point. That your opponent is not going to just, you know, accept the fact that they may be, you know, that they will lose, right? And oftentimes the person who's picking the fight feels threatened because, you know, they think they're going to lose something, and they have some ego to protect, and they're probably going to stop at almost nothing to protect that. Now, that's one type of combat. We'll go to the other type of combat, which is kind of military combat, and we'll talk about the historical and the modern. Historically, when we're talking about swords, there's a dynamic which is trained a lot, and you'll see this in almost every military source from history, is what they teach their infantry, which is essentially you're going to have people that are going to run toward each other. They're going to try to effect one or two attacks on whatever, on a particular target, and try to get past them, right, and then get to the next one, and they try to slowly overcome, and the idea, what happens is the two sides clash into that big huge mass, and then whoever pushes, you know, one back there or whatever. So in those situations, when you're talking about what you're doing with a sword, this is why you're going to see lots of taking it around your head, you know, all of that kind of thing. If you watch the Shicho training hall episode that with Brendan fighting two people, you'll notice that at one point he dispatches one and notices that the other opponent is now on a kind of weird trajectory to him, and he cannot go this way. He's stepped wrong or whatever. He has to, and he turns around, right? That's going to happen, right? Not only is that going to happen, when it happens, if you're happening it in that huge melee, you would better turn right back around right quick, right? Because you have swords and spears and people all over you, and not just all over you, like all over you, you know, like on you, and people bumping you, and, you know, all that kind of thing. So these are the types of things that you're going to see in the Shicho, that kind of thing, which is much more militaristic. You're going to see a little bit of that in the Ataru and the Shen, which is more about moving through areas and being defensive, striking here, striking there, but really being defensive and going for the specific target, for the one target that will bring the whole thing down. And that's kind of a strategy that's trained, or a group of strategies that is trained. So, Robert, do you want to chime in on this particular topic?
I do know that when I was training in the Marine Corps in basic training, they actually did go over some physical combat, and basically bayonet strikes from a weapon, or butt strokes, or using whatever you've got. And they said that if that were to happen, if you were to be overrun, it would be not one person. It would be a wave of people coming at you. It's endurance-wise is probably the biggest thing, because you're swinging, you're dodging, you're moving. Here comes a strike. Here comes another strike. You're striking. You're defending. You're striking. 5 minutes. I mean, boxers go 3 rounds and they look exhausted. And they're just in there for sport. And fighting for your life is totally, totally different. On a little different scope, though, when it comes to swords and shields and attacks, the Shicho is perfect. It's simple. It's program basics that allow you to make big, long strokes, and that could take 1, 2, maybe even 3 targets down. And you have to know that they could be coming at you 3 at a time, 2 at a time. That's the older style way of warfare.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I know we got blasters and stuff like that in Star Wars and stuff like that, but you know, the way I look at blasters, most people look at them as kind of like guns, and the way I look at them is they're more like arrows, because they don't quite hit the target like a real gun would. I mean, if they really had those blasters, you could freaking mow down all of those people in no time flat. You know, those droids would just walk over. So there has to be some, you know, limitation to why they fly all over the place and they don't hit anybody. But and hence you can block them.
The other thing I was thinking about, though, is that in larger battlefield concepts, they focus more training on maneuver than direct combat. Because if you can outflank, if you can get behind, if you can strategically surround, you could end the combat before it even begins.
Yes, that's right there. Is totally it. It's the flanking, it's the maneuvering. We started doing that in the camps, having people try, you know, having the kids try to stay in a formation and be able to change formations depending on what type of attack is kind of coming into their group, you know, so that they can cover particular areas. And it ain't easy.
No, absolutely right. And in a battlefield, I mean, you're talking about small-scale formations, 4 or 5 people. Right. When it comes to military units, you're talking 100 people in each unit or more. They're moving miles to maneuver around, and they're using cover and camouflage and concealment to hide their movement, or distraction or misdirection. And this is at the heart of battlefield combat. Even in an asymmetrical warfare like we're at, you've got your enemy trying to think they're somewhere and attack you completely from the other side. SWAT teams do this. They will blast out a window and come in through the wall. It's the concept of mental misdirection and taking advantage of reaction time, readiness, tiring out the enemy, timing, everything you read in Sun Tzu.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Matt. Go ahead.
I was laughing and agreeing.
Oh, okay. But yeah, with the Sun Tzu, yeah, you can totally do that with just your positioning, and like you said, even in modern day warfare, right? It's the whole. I mean, I guess it's ironic that the word fair is in warfare, because there's nothing fair about it. It's all trying to get the unfair advantage, and the more unfair advantage you can get, the better, because, well, you're dealing with all these lives. You're not just playing a game.
One of the sayings I like to tell my students is, if you're in a fair fight, your tactics suck. And
right.
If you let yourself get into a scenario, it's your fault.
Right. Yeah. I mean, unless ambushes, all of that kind of thing. But again, that's why we train. You know. To give a funny example, just look at Inspector Clouseau.
We're all looking at Inspector Clouseau now.
Yes. I wish we could go to Inspector Clouseau.
Yeah. I mean, again, like I said, I played with FCA, so I've been involved in some large-scale maneuvers with literally hundreds of people on a side, and I've been in positions where I've been able to watch one side control another by moving people around in the backfield. Moving units of people causes the other side to start shifting some of their people, and it is a game of chess in some ways, to try and get someone to overcommit or undercommit and then take advantage when the weakness pops up from the maneuvering, just by moving people around.
Absolutely. It's like World of Warcraft. We would do all of that when we first started. Not World of Warcraft, Warcraft. Not before World of Warcraft. My friend would hook up and play games between our friends. You know, just 3 or 4 of us, and we would always make secret little alliances. And then, like, I would say, okay, I'm going to ally with this person, but then I'm going to sneak over here, and I'm going to say, hey, let's be friends, and I'll defend you, and put a whole bunch of troops into their camp, and then you just flip that little switch of alliance, and they all start attacking everybody. So yeah, I mean, it's war as hell. What are you gonna do? But yeah, the tactics of combat, if we take what you said, Jeff, earlier, if we take it from fighting, there's fighting, right? The actual fight. So there's the mechanics of what's happening right there. But in the combat scenario, it's all about deception. It's all about, outthinking the other guy, being quicker, being more guileful, because it's never going to be fair. If you're lucky, you'll be on the top of that. Most of the time, if you're just somebody who minds their own business, and I hope you are, if trouble happens, more than likely you will be at the disadvantage, and so you have to train for that. You have to train to be at the disadvantage, just like Orinthus said. I'm 6'2", right? I'm also pretty big, so just like him, I know, and I have plenty of experience. Nobody comes up to me, unless they are a big guy themselves by themselves. They always come with friends, because, well, they're not stupid. Anywho, okay. Do we have anything to wrap up here, guys? We got about 8 minutes here. Anything did we want to touch on that we haven't?
No, it looks like we've covered a lot of the relevant topics. We went from what sorts of techniques and exercises can an individual do to large-scale warfare, but it does scale back fairly easily. Maneuvering and feinting with a unit is similar in concept to maneuvering and feinting with a sword.
Yes. Yes. And the maneuvering and feinting and all that kind of stuff, working with people, and this is why we did it with the kids, is it takes an enormous amount of teamwork and communication. And that's very difficult.
Oh, yes. Quite.
Yeah, one of the things I've started doing at our dojo on sparring nights, because we've got this new armor that covers front and back, as opposed to the bogu, which was just the front, we'll actually do multiple opponents, because it's not always that the multiple opponents are the bad guys. Sometimes you've got two people who are trying to defend themselves against one person. It doesn't always work. Everybody always thinks just because you're outnumbered, you're the good guy. It's not the way it works. So we'll get people communicating and talking and learning how to push them that way. I'm going to go this way, and you're trying to get the advantage while they're trying to keep just one person in striking distance as opposed to two. So it's something that's a lot of fun. It's probably more fun than it should be, but
Right.
it's more fun than even sparring, because you apply that extra component. So it's something that we have a lot of fun doing in our dojo, but it takes on a whole other ball game as opposed to that just where your opponent is, they're right in front of you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And if you want to talk about a good scenario where you have the multiple opponents being the good guys, is any type of law enforcement situation where you're trying to apprehend a violent offender, right? You've got some guy running around with a weapon, right? Endangering people, being very aggressive, and like we said, you guys, being the law officers or the superheroes or whatever you want to imagine yourself being, you're the Jedi, right? You have to contain this individual while minimizing the amount of damage that they're doing, right? And you can see it in every movie. What happens with the villain? They always take some innocent and hold the sword to their throat. Stand back or I'm gonna, and it's like, well, I mean, that's what it is. So yeah, I love the idea of having multiple people kind of going out. Everybody thinks of them being the one that's outnumbered, right? So when anybody trains multiple opponents or anybody asks anything about multiple opponents, is that good against multiple opponents, right? Well, of course it is. Everything, I mean, there's nothing to it. You're basically just swinging your sword and trying to hit the guy, right? It's everything leading up to it. That's the difficult part, right? Communicating with your team members, knowing where they are, knowing where the target is, and not being confused. If you're outnumbered, knowing where your opponents are, keeping them stacked on top of each other. So it's a multi-dimensional, it's a multi thing. It's extremely exciting because it really raises the level of urgency, because you have that dynamic there.
Yeah, I do know that fighting multiple opponents puts you more in the moment than ever fighting a single one, because now your awareness is so astute, you have to be looking in every direction. Your situational awareness is magnified because you have to know who's behind me, who's in front of me, friend or foe, do I swing, do I not swing, and it keeps you locked in the moment. And that's what's so energizing about it, is just being in that moment, knowing that it can happen at any time, from anywhere. You have to stay in the moment, and I love that aspect of going against multiple opponents anytime I have in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I mean it's a rare thing to have, because it's hard to find sparring partners already, just single ones. But if you can get a group together and you can train some of this stuff, even training multiples against multiples, that's a difficult thing too, because you have two teams, right? Two teams who are trying to communicate with each other, right, and not let the other team realize what the other one, so it becomes, and yeah, we're doing these as games. We're doing them with lightsabers and all this kind of stuff. But the drills and these games, they come from a real place that got our civilizations where we are. How did they win those wars that you read about, like this? A lot of times it's just chance. Look at the Mongols in Japan, and the kamikaze, right? The divine wind. Like, uh-oh, here comes, the most fearsome army the world has ever seen, and here comes a hurricane. Whoosh! Dodged a bullet on that one. But,
literal fog of war.
Yes. All right. Okay, well, we got a couple minutes here. Do we have anything to finish up here with?
Has anybody posted any questions in through any of the social media?
I don't see any. I can check the areas very quickly.
How does everybody feel about? Have we addressed the topic of the show thoroughly?
I think so.
Yeah, as do I.
Okay. Well, we got a couple people watching, but no questions as of yet. So I guess we can probably wrap it up here. Yeah. So my thanks to our panel this evening, Jeff, Matt, Robert. Thanks for joining us and giving us your insight to these ever so heavy topics. Yes, but so we'll just say good night for the evening, and have a great weekend. May the Force be with you, and happy sabering.